Hello Misfits and welcome. In today's video, we are talking all about railroading. What is it? What is it not? Is it ever okay? Is it never okay? We're gonna be getting into all of those things, so let's just jump into it. So first, what is railroading? Railroading is basically when you force something to happen or force someone to do something, and they don't really have a say in the matter, and a lot of times this happens quickly or, according to the definition, unfairly, which is a big reason why a lot of people really hate railroading, particularly in TTRPGs. So when we use railroading in reference to those types of games, it basically means that the players don't have a say in what happens or how the story unfolds. Their choices no longer matter. They are forced down a very specific plot or series of events, and it doesn't really matter what they do, how they enter these scenarios or leave them, because it's always going to be the same. Railroading in TTRPGs can also be applied to the illusion of choice, where, you give them options, but regardless of what they choose, it results in the same thing. So let's say the players arrive at a fork in the road. Railroading them from that scenario would be, regardless of whether they choose right or left, it leads to the exact same event. Though a step further would be, they're led down the forest path and there is no fork, it's just going to lead to a very specific place and they have to carry out whatever scenario is happening there. Now, is railroading ever okay or is it always bad? There are a few scenarios in which I would consider railroading to be somewhat allowed. First, basically when you're starting a campaign, you might have to do just a little bit of railroading to get them to that first plot hook that starts the entire story. If you're running a published module, there's probably going to be just a little bit of railroading that happens to get them into the adventure. In Cursive Strahd, you might have to do a little bit of railroading just to get them to walk through the mist and arrive in Barovia. Or if you really need them to get to the village of Barovia where Irina is, you might have to kind of force them down that path to arrive at that town. That would be railroading, because you're kind of forcing them to get there. It doesn't really matter what they do. You're trying to just get them to that first starting point. In Lost Mines of Phandelver, at the very start of that adventure, I believe the adventurers are on a route to Phandalin, and there is like a dead horse across the road in sort of the middle of this sort of gorge or valley or something. And you pretty much have to investigate this horse and you kind of have to take that route. It sparks an event. It leads to kind of the start of that whole little story. That has to happen, basically. So in order to get that to take place, you might have to do just a little bit of railroading just to make sure that starts. Now, that's not to say you couldn't, as the DM, decide to throw the book out the window and just take things in a totally different direction, but if you are trying to play out the story as it's written, you might have to kind of twist your player's arms just a little bit to get some things started. Another instance in where maybe railroading occurs is, let's say you've done a lot of prep work and your players just go the complete opposite direction. Something that you could do is just take all the prep and all the things that you've gotten ready for this campaign and just stick it in the direction that your players go. So your players arrive at a fork in the road and they're presented with left or right, and you've only prepared stuff for the left road. You could just take that, stick it on the right side, and if they choose right, you've got your stuff prepped. And you don't have to, immediately go to break or cancel the game because they've done something you didn't account for. I think this instance of having to railroad is going to come up a little bit more often for newer DMs that aren't yet accustomed to how much prep work might be involved in order to counteract your player's tendency to, take things off course and kind of derail the plot. As you get more accustomed to flying by the seat of your pants, you're probably not going to have to do this as much. And I would encourage you to learn how to avoid these sort of scenarios. Don't offer them a fork in the road if you only have one path of the fork prepared. Though there are some scenarios in which railroading might have to happen or might be kind of okay, it's generally something that shouldn't be a regular practice. It should be emergencies or happen at the very beginning of the game, and after that, we need to allow the player's choices and decisions to impact the story, because really that is the heart of these types of games. But why do people keep talking about railroading or complaining about railroading, or why are there arguments surrounding this topic, and what is it, and why it's okay or why it's not? Well, I think a lot of people confuse railroading with linear storytelling. Linear storytelling is basically a sort of predetermined series of events that are presented in a particular order. Most books and novels are going to be a linear story with a specific plot that runs through the entire story. Most movies are going to be linear storytelling with a plot that we follow. There are plenty of video games that follow a linear storytelling kind of style. Now, you might be thinking, predetermined events that happen in a specific order sounds an awful lot like railroading. It does. There are some similarities, but in TTRPGs, I would argue that linear storytelling is handled a little differently. There is still a sort of predetermined series of events or sort of a general plot that is followed, but player decisions still factor into how these events play out and how you enter or approach these scenarios and leave them. Let's say one of our predetermined events is needing to acquire an item from a mansion. In a TTRPG setting, I would present them with that quest or that problem, and then I would leave it up to them to decide how they want to do that. So the party could either brute force their way into the mansion, guns blazing and swords swinging. They could sneak into the mansion from the back door or the sewers, or come from the roof. They could lie their way into the mansion. They could disguise themselves and, sort of charm the guards and, put on their most charismatic performances and try to ease their way in that way. There are lots of different ways in which they could approach that event and try to carry out that quest. And how successful they are at that could determine what the next events are or how easy or difficult they will be. So we still have these predetermined things, these predetermined story elements and events, but there's still player choice involved, and it could still affect the overall outcome and how the plot sort of shifts to match that. Linear storytelling lends itself really well to games that have an emphasis on storytelling or that are very narrative driven or RP heavy, because you kind of have this sort of plot line that runs through the entire campaign. And so you can start with smaller events and slowly build them and make them more and more important and more sort of grand and wide-reaching, so that your characters feel like they start small and grow and become these bigger characters. You also can, with linear storytelling, more easily create sort of overarching themes. You could have character arcs that match up with this sort of plot that's running through the story. There are a lot of different things that you can do with this, and that's why linear storytelling is more common in these sort of RP-heavy styles of game. Something else I would stress about linear storytelling is, as a DM, though you are predetermining these events, I would really stress having a very sort of bare bones skeleton of these different events, and make sure in your mind that you are open to moving those around or changing those completely. Because as they make these decisions and approach this first event, that determines how well they'll succeed at that event. and maybe it fails. Maybe they aren't successful. So when we get to the next event, that might have changed, or that might be more difficult or more easy. They might have different ways to approach that event based on what they have done previously, or it's a completely different thing. You sort of don't map out everything ahead of time because this is a story that we are writing as we go. This is a story that we are telling as a collaborative experience at our table. Whereas railroading, you are not open to change. It is all going to stay exactly the same. There is going to be no swapping around or moving. It is rigid. Linear storytelling can bend and shift and sort of change. So, railroading. Railroading is the absence of choice or the complete illusion of choice. Player actions and decisions do not factor into the story. They do not factor into what events happen next. They do not factor into how successful or unsuccessful the players will be. That is railroading. There is no choice. Linear storytelling, though it's predetermined events or plot points, choices still matter. They affect the likelihood of success or failure, and they can sort of determine how one might approach these different events, or even what events could be offered afterward. They're very different things. They just have some minor similarities. So that is my video on railroading. This is definitely often sort of like a point of contention, or sort of like a hot button like word that we throw out and we shake our fists at. But I think a lot of times we just get confused about what exactly railroading is, and we confuse it with these other ways of telling stories and playing through campaigns. So hopefully I have sort of explained things a little bit better and given you a better grasp of what these words mean, if they're okay, if they're not, all those things. If you found this video useful, please feel free to like and subscribe, but more importantly, please leave me a comment down below. Tell me some instances of maybe which you had to railroad your players, or tell me about some times when the decisions your players made completely altered your plans and what you were hoping to happen in your game, and how it just sort of changed everything. I would love to hear about all of that. But with all of that said, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week, and I will see you again next time. Something as a DM that favors long form campaigns that last like 2+ years, that are generally in a linear fashion, is oftentimes I will plan or think up these cool events and plot points that could happen, and then I have to wait forever until they take place. Some of the stuff that is happening in my current campaign, I've literally been sitting on and keeping secret for years. And it is so frustrating. I also have a lot of my plans and ideas for my next campaign already sort of cooking up in my head. And I know that campaign is like, you know, at least 1.5 years or more away. And some of the stuff I've thought about probably wouldn't even happen until, you know, a decent amount of time through the campaign, assuming it wouldn't get completely changed or altered based off of what my players do. So I'm curious, what is the longest you've ever sat on a reveal or a secret or a plot point or something in your campaign? I think for me, it would have to be like 2 years maybe, where I've had to keep something to myself for that amount of time before I got to share it. But I'm curious if any of you have had to do that longer, because that's certainly one of the most frustrating aspects, I think, of DMing. Oh, and yes, I have dyed my hair. It's sort of like a plumish color. I don't expect this to last very long, but if you were confused by the hair color, it is different. You're not losing your mind. Anyway, have a good day, guys, and I'll see you next time.